Hey there everyone, Michael A. Bryan here from the Oracular School of Astrology. And before we dive into today's program, I just want to say a major thank you to all of you who've been supporting my work by purchasing my books, Mastering Traditional Astrology, Horary Astrology and the Natal Promise, and the New Western Medical Astrology. Thank you all so much for supporting the work that we do over here and for supporting me as a self-published author. And if you haven't already purchased my books, please make sure to go over on Amazon and grab yourself copies today so that you can dive into this wonderful world of magical astrology that I've curated for you within these 3 books. And if you've already purchased copies of these books, then please make sure to leave us a review over on Amazon, because that is how Amazon supports me as a self-published author. Once again, thank you so much from the bottom of my heart, and do enjoy today's program. Hi there everyone, Michael A. Bryan here from the Oracular School of Astrology, and today we are diving into the chart of Jeffrey Epstein once again, but this time from the perspective of predictive astrology as well as Uranian astrology. If you've missed our first segment on the deep dive of Jeffrey Epstein's natal chart, we're going to put that down below in the comment section so that you can go and give that a watch just to orient yourself for the work that we're going to dive into together right now. For those of you, if this is your first time joining us here on the Oraculars podcast, this is your touchstone for concrete event-based astrology here on the internet. And if that is something that you want to be a part of, then by all means, subscribe to the Oraculars podcast wherever you find us on the internet. And if you're watching on YouTube, then make sure to hit the notification bell so that you receive notifications of when we come out with episodes every single week. Now, without further ado, let us dive into our predictive chart work for Jeffrey Epstein. Today, we're going to be taking a look at the arrests of Jeffrey Epstein, and my primary goal is to do this by looking at the eclipse charts that correspond with those arrests. And we know that he was first arrested in July 27th, 2006, or rather, he was first arrested on July 27, 2006 in Palm Beach, Florida, and he was arrested because the local police were investigating him into allegations that he had paid underage girls for sexual massages, and he had sexually abused minors at his Palm Beach mansion, and he had used a system in which victims were encouraged to recruit other girls, and he was initially charged under Florida state law with unlawful sex with the minor and prostitution-related offenses. So we're going to first start by taking a look at the eclipse chart for July 27th, 2026, before taking a look at the eclipse chart for July 6th, 2019, when he was arrested for the last time. All right, so here on the screen, we have the eclipse chart for March 29th, 2006. And under the auspices of this eclipse, he was arrested the first time in Palm Beach, Florida. Whenever taking a look at an eclipse chart, we always want to first start by understanding where is the eclipse within the chart, because the house location of the eclipse is going to be one of the most important things for us to look at and for us to assess from the perspective of understanding how that eclipse is going to manifest within the native. Now, what I think is really important for us to know is that within traditional astrology, eclipses always represent crisis. Or rather, eclipses always represent crises, events within our lives that represent a sharp spike from the norm of our daily existence. This is just the reality of eclipses. Eclipses have always represented crises within traditional astrology, and to that end, their usefulness as a predictive tool is oftentimes only going to be to indicate where a crisis is going to unfold within the life of a person within a given period of time. And so to the question as to whether or not eclipses are a generally useful predictive tool, I would say that they are not generally useful, but rather they are specifically useful if we are going to take a look at a chart from the perspective of where crisis is most likely to strike within the life of a person within a 6-month period, because we know that the interval between eclipses tends to be 6 months or approximately 6 months. Another thing to know is that traditionally speaking, we tend to only pay attention to the solar eclipse chart. I think a part of that is because natal astrology is a very sun-based subject, we tend to view the various chapters of our lives based on the ingress of the transiting sun into the position that it held at our time of birth. And so the reality is that we are oftentimes, if not all the times, going to be using the solar eclipse chart as our major predictive measure for the period of time that we're looking at. The lunar eclipse could be useful as well. I have never really considered the lunar eclipse within my own predictive work. And I don't really know a lot of professional seasoned astrologers who do. However, if you use the lunar eclipse, fine by me. There's a lot of YouTube content that comes out every lunar eclipse. And so maybe it has its usefulness. But from the perspective of predicting concrete events, we tend to focus on the solar eclipse. And I think there are also metaphysical reasons for that. We know that the sun is the ruler, in a sense, of our physical world of individual beings, because it is by the light of the sun that we have the ability to see ourselves as individual beings, whereas by the light of the moon, our distinct edges tend to blend in and bleed in with the background around us. So the sun really has to do with our concrete existence and our concrete reality, and therefore it only makes sense that it has to do with the concrete, specific, individualized events that occur within our lives within a given period of time. So probably that's why we, from a metaphysical perspective, prefer to use the solar eclipse. I don't really have any other reason as to why that is the case, but in general, in traditional astrology, we use the solar eclipse. Now, we see that the solar eclipse is landing in his third house. Whenever we have the eclipse landing within our third house, that can say that the crisis for us within that 6-month period is going to be a crisis that directly impacts our local community, or a crisis that directly impacts where we find ourselves rooted at that period in time. What does that mean? That means that very often when a person has the eclipse strongly impacting their chart and also landing in their third house, that could indicate a period of relocation. That at this time, the native is choosing to relocate either because he may feel forced to relocate or because circumstances around him are moving him in the direction of relocating. This could be an indication that this could be a period of time in which he is negotiating his relationship to where he lives and whether or not he wants to live there anymore. So that is what the eclipse in the third house could indicate in general for all of us. Now, the reality is that every time you have the eclipse landing in your third house, you don't necessarily relocate. So what are the other highest things that are likely with the eclipse landing in the third house? The other thing that happens, if it's not the relocation, is that there could be a major event within our lives within the next 6-month period that directly impacts our siblings and other aspects that the eclipse makes within our natal chart will indicate how deeply impacted our siblings are going to be, or how true or how strongly that idea of the eclipse impacting our siblings is going to be within the given period of time that the eclipse indicates, which is 6 months. And the final thing that I oftentimes find that the eclipse indicates when it lands in the third house is that this could be a period where we find ourselves going back to school. Or this could be a period where we find ourselves brushing up on our own foundational knowledge or education about something. So these are the 3 things that the eclipse landing in the third house can manifest as. And how I just listed them represents the hierarchy of these 3 things from what is most likely to happen, then what is secondarily likely to happen, then what is last and least likely to happen. So that is the hierarchy of events that might potentially manifest within our lives if we do have the eclipse landing within our third house. First one being relocation, either because we are forced to relocate or because we just feel like this isn't a place where I can live anymore. Second one being event that highlights the siblings. And final one is definitely going to be event that is highlighting my need to go back to school. So those are the 3 things we see with the eclipse within the third house. Now, after we've identified the house location of the eclipse within our natal charts, the very next thing that we should do is take a look at what planets or angles within our natal chart the eclipse is impacting. And the reason for that is because the eclipse is going to happen for everybody on the planet. That is a fact of life. However, not everybody on the planet goes through a major crisis every single eclipse season. And the reason for that is because not everybody on the planet is going to be impacted by the eclipse in the same way as everybody else. So in order for us to know whether or not this eclipse is going to be directly impactful for him and to him, we have to first assess whether or not the eclipse is afflicting things within his chart. And to this end, we only look at the hard aspects, because the hard aspects have always been forces of affliction within traditional astrology. If the eclipse is afflicting things within his chart, there is a very strong likelihood that within this 6-month period, some crisis in relation to the thing that the eclipse is afflicting is going to manifest within his life. So let's go and take a look. Automatically, we see within his chart that he is having the eclipse landing within 1 degree of his natal moon. And so we can say that from a universal perspective, the moon represents our domestic affairs, the moon represents our family, the moon represents how we feel safe within the world and where we feel safe within the world. So for us, this could be another form of corroboration that's saying to us that at this moment, this native may feel very jarred within his physical reality. And we remember this is the first time he got arrested. And so chances are he did feel very jarred within his physical reality, because chances are if he was performing his criminal activities at this location for God knows how long, and this is the year that he got arrested, then chances are his sense of domestic security would have shifted drastically, and he would have felt a sense of no longer being welcome within that community, which is once again what the 3rd house represents, and also no longer feeling at ease or safe within his local environment, which is once again what the 3rd house represents. So we have his sense of domestic security being eclipsed. Why do I say domestic security? Because that's what the moon represents in general. His sense of domestic security is being eclipsed at this moment, which could fill him with a sense of fear regarding where he lives, and once again, which could precipitate him desiring to relocate. Now that we've taken a look at that, we can go and see what else this eclipse is afflicting within his chart. The very next thing that we see this eclipse is afflicting within his chart is his natal Uranus. Now, I have a very big statement to make about the eclipse afflicting his natal Uranus, because Uranus does not belong to any one of us within our natal charts, not even a little bit. Your Uranus, your Neptune, your Pluto do not belong to you in any specific sort of way. So people will look at this Uranus and say, oh, he has Uranus in Cancer, and therefore that means that the things that Cancer rules within his life are going to be jostled or shaken within this lifetime. That isn't really the most intelligent thing to say, because we know that Uranus takes about 84 years to move through all 12 signs of the zodiac, which means that Uranus within his chart does not belong to him in any personal way. This is something I have to keep on reiterating within astrological spaces, and I'm not sure why. So the reality is, you having Pluto in Leo does not impact you directly or make you a particular sort of way directly, no more than you having Neptune in Libra causes you to be a particular way. I once had a student who said that my life is in shambles because I have Neptune in Scorpio. And this is the product of a type of astrology that's fundamentally unuseful, because Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto being in any sign of the zodiac within your natal chart is not the reason for anything at all within your life. Your life might be in shambles for other reasons, but it's not going to be because you have Uranus in a sign or Neptune in a sign or Pluto in a sign. These things just don't make any sense whatsoever, and the sooner we get them out of our system in astrology, the better. So there's that. Secondarily, the eclipse is afflicting his natal Uranus. However, the natal Uranus being afflicted by the eclipse means nothing, because the eclipse is afflicting the natal Uranus for everybody who was born within a 6-month period of time of Jeffrey Epstein. Therefore, we cannot say that his natal Uranus was personally afflicted by the eclipse. Therefore, what we can say is that the eclipse is afflicting his ascendant-descendant axis, and as a result of his Uranus being conjunct his descendant, this eclipse is triggering or awakening or catalyzing whatever is within that Uranus in relationship to the angle that it is conjunct. But it is not the eclipse afflicting the Uranus by itself that is important. It is the eclipse afflicting the ascendant-descendant axis that is important, and that affliction bleeds through into the Uranus because the Uranus is also conjunct that axis. So, the eclipse squaring his ascendant-descendant is saying to us that 1, this eclipse will impact him very personally within this next 6-month period. 2, he is most likely going to receive the crisis end of this eclipse's manifestation within this next 6-month period. And 3, that crisis may impact not just his personal well-being and his personal sense of safety and vitality, which is what the first house represents, but it's also going to negatively impact his intimate connections and his relationships, which is what the 7th house is representing. And since we see the Uranus there as well, it could also indicate a massive upheaval within the landscape of his intimate connections. Now, we already know that this is going to be the case because the moon within this eclipse chart is specifically the ruler of his 7th house. So we have the moon as the universal significator of his domestic well-being in general, but we also have the moon as the specific significator of his love life and his romantic affairs. Therefore, we already know that his love life and his romantic affairs are likely to be going through some major level of upheaval, some major period of crisis within this coming 6-month period as a result of his natal moon being eclipsed. But now we see that with this eclipse squaring the ascendant-descendant axis and also triggering the latent portion of his destiny that Uranus is holding in the 7th house, could say that this could be a period of time in which his intimate connections, his romantic relationships go through a period of deep tumult, deep upheaval, and a great sense of volatile jostling that causes him to no longer feel safe or secure within those intimate connections. Now, I don't necessarily know the extent of his intimate connections or whether or not his intimate connections was primarily with minors. However, this could be an indication that if indeed his intimate connections were primarily with minors, then this is a period where that love affair that he was having with minors is completely being jostled and shaken and broken through and destroyed fundamentally, because Uranus represents the lightning that strikes. We are living our lives as well as can be. We never expect to get struck by lightning until we're struck by lightning. And the lightning strikes within his most intimate romantic state of affairs where he feels he should be safest. And as a result of that, he feels this deep sense of unsafety, of insecurity, and of no longer being able to return to those romantic affairs in the ways that he would like, which could tie into this larger sense that upon him being released, he could have said, hey, this entire place where I find myself is no longer a place where I should be. I need to get out of here because this is no longer a safe environment for me within this lifetime. So these are the things that we see based on the eclipse afflicting his chart in the ways that it is. Now from there, the very next thing that we do with every eclipse chart is we then want to take a look at the eclipse planets. Now, I specifically like to look at the eclipse malefics because once again, I use the eclipses as a specific measuring device to let me know whether or not there is going to be a crisis occurring within the life of the native within the next 6-month period. I don't really use the eclipses to let me know whether or not there are going to be uplifting, joyful things occurring. And a part of that is because I would use the solar return chart of the native as a general barometer for the year ahead. Whereas I would use the eclipse chart specifically to indicate for me where in the life of the native within the coming 6 months I am most likely going to see some potholes in the road or some level of crisis that the native needs to be aware of. So my next step after taking a look at the planets in the chart that the eclipse is afflicting is going to be to see whether or not the malefics within his chart, or rather whether or not the malefics within the eclipse chart are also afflicting planets within his nativity. And the first thing that we see to that end is that his natal sun is being afflicted by Saturn within the eclipse chart. Now, this is significant because we know that the sun within the chart of a man is going to represent his body from a universal perspective. So if we have the body of this man being afflicted by Saturn in the eclipse, this can be an indication. Let me say that again. If we have the body of this man being afflicted by Saturn in the eclipse, this can be an indication that at this time, this man feels as if his body is in a state of bondage. Or at this time, this man feels as if his body is in a state of immobility. We're just describing Saturn words. We aren't even talking about the fact that we know that this is the period in which he was arrested. We're just describing Saturn words. So at this time, this man's body could have been in a state of bondage, in a state of captivity, in a state where he felt as if he had limited mobility, in a state where no matter how hard he tried, he always found himself facing the same dead end, in a state where he felt restricted, in a state where he felt as if the world of responsibility and the weight of all of his karma was now crashing down onto his shoulders, because Saturn is the god of consequences as well. And the consequences that Saturn brings our way are consequences that are directly born out of our actions that we have done over the course of time. So Saturn is the god of time, karma, and consequence. Therefore, with Saturn in opposition to his natal sun, or rather with the eclipse Saturn in opposition to his natal sun, this could be a period of time in which he felt not only the weight of all of his responsibilities landing on his shoulders, but also the weight of his karma, the accumulative effect of his actions within this lifetime landing on his shoulders in a way that led him into an even deeper state of feeling trapped or in bondage or really depressed. He could have felt as if he was in a deep state of depression within this 6-month period as a result not of just the world demanding him to pay the piper, but also his actions in the past now catching up with him and demanding him to pay the piper. So this is something that we see with the eclipse Saturn in opposition to his natal sun. Now, another thing that we see is that this Saturn is also in a square relationship with his MCIC axis. The reason why this is important is because an eclipse is only going to be as important in your life as, let me say that again. An eclipse is only going to be important within your life if that eclipse is baked into your natal chart. If an eclipse is happening, but it is not impacting your natal chart in any way, shape, or form, then go forth and conquer and live your best life. Just because an eclipse is happening doesn't mean that you are affected by it. I find that this is another thing that newer astrologers like to do. Newer astrologers like to be affected by everything. Every Mercury retrograde, oh, the sky is falling. Every planet retrograde, oh, the sky is falling. Every eclipse, oh, I can feel the eclipse in my bones, I can't go to work today. Every single anything, oh, something is happening, oh, it's always calamity within the life of newer astrologers, because newer astrologers I think a part of trying to feel relevant within a community that you're trying to be a part of is you want to be the mascot of every single planetary influence. So Mars goes retrograde, Mars goes direct. Oh my God, I feel it in my muscles. You don't feel anything. The reality is that an eclipse will only impact you if that eclipse is impacting you. And if that eclipse is not impacting you, go forth and live your healthy, happy. And if that eclipse is not impacting you, go forth and live your happy, healthy life, basically. This eclipse, most indubitably, is impacting him. I like to say that word. This Saturn is in a square relationship with his MCIC axis. What that is saying to us is that within this next 6-month period, this person is going to undergo a major reckoning in terms of his public persona in the world at large, who he is seen as being within the world at large, but also in terms of how he finds himself rooted physically within his local environment. Because we know that the IC has to do with the roots that we establish for ourselves and the home that we establish for ourselves within the world. So in every way, shape, or form, we see his life being impacted by this eclipse. We see himself, his own being, and his love life being afflicted by the eclipse. We also see his public identity as well as his home life being impacted by the eclipse. We also see his intimate relationships via the moon, ruler of the 7th house within his chart, impacted by the eclipse and jostled by this eclipse and shaken by this eclipse and completely turned upside down by this eclipse. Every single thing within his life that could possibly be impacted by the eclipse is most definitely being impacted by this eclipse. He probably should have spoken to an astrologer. Now, as we continue to go forward within this reading, I then go on and see the next malefic and how that malefic is impacting his chart within the 6-month period. And the next malefic for me is going to be the Uranus. So I see that the eclipse Uranus is at 12 degrees Pisces, 16 minutes, and that eclipse Uranus is afflicting his Mars at 15 degrees Pisces and is also afflicting his Venus at 16 degrees of Pisces. Now, when I look within his chart, that Mars just so happens to be the specific ruler of his 3rd house. And what did I say earlier? I said that when the eclipse is terrestrially occurring within the 3rd house within our natal charts, that can oftentimes be an indication that it's time to move. Similarly, in the solar return chart, when you have the solar return landing within the 3rd house of your natal chart, that can be an indication that this could be a year to move, or that something going on within the life of your siblings is going to take center stage for you this year, or it can indicate that it's time to go back to school to brush up on your foundational knowledge. Those are the top 3 things that happens whenever your solar return ascendant is landing within your natal 3rd house, or if the eclipse is landing within your natal 3rd house. And I thought this was going to be the next book after my next book, but that's not the case, because I recently gave myself the responsibility of coming out with a Uranian astrology book. So we are going to have the natal astrology book as the next book, which you will receive in the course of the next 6 months, followed by the Uranian astrology book, which we are writing simultaneously, followed by the solar return book, which is already completely finished being written. However, in the sequence of things, I want to publish the natal book, then the Uranian astrology book, so that we can be done with this topic of natal astrology altogether. And then after that, the solar return book. And then after that, the transits book. And then after that, the tarot book. So every time I think I'm getting closer and closer to my tarot destiny, something just comes in and turns me upside down. Anyway, so this eclipse is landing on his natal Mars, and we see that Mars is the specific ruler of his 3rd house, and Mars is also the specific ruler of the 11th house. Now, I have to say something to you all, because I think that this is also an important thing for us to know, particularly in terms of natal astrology in general. When we find ourselves weaving a particular story as astrologers, and we see some random element introducing itself into that story, chances are we should ignore the random element. So, for example, we've already started weaving a story of his local environment no longer being a safe or stable place for him. And as a result of that, within this period of time, he's going to desire to move. That's a story we've already started saying. The random element that was just thrown in by this Mars is that Mars is also the ruler of the 11th house. Now, surely we could go and start saying something about his friends being unstable or his friends being a source of volatility or something else. However, just because you can say something in astrology doesn't mean you should say something. And one of the things that I think is sacred for us to maintain as astrologers is our ability to stick with the narrative that is naturally unfolding. One of the things, particularly with newer astrologers, that I oftentimes find is that the newer astrologer can't handle the fact that we haven't spoken about the Mars ruling the 11th house. So the newer astrologer will, yes, talk about the 3rd house, which corroborates the story that we're building, but the newer astrologer will also be very angst-filled if we don't also talk about the 11th house, which has nothing to do with the story that we have already been establishing thus far. That is a sign for me of someone not being so seasoned within their practice, because the more seasoned you are within your practice, the more you realize that the story that you are establishing is the most important thing. And if that story is already taking you down a particular path, for you to now throw in random elements like whatever the 11th house rules or whatever the 10th house rules, here we see this Mars is ruling the 10th house. The 10th house is going to be more significant to the story that we are telling. I didn't see the Mars ruling the 10th house initially, so forgive me. But here we see the Mars ruling the 10th house. The 10th house is going to be more significant to the story that we're telling because we've already said that the Saturn is in a square relationship with that MCIC, and we've already brought his public reputation under scrutiny by virtue of that Saturn. Therefore, the Mars ruling the 3rd house and saying he's just about had it with Florida and he's ready to relocate. And the Mars ruling the 10th house saying at this moment his public persona is going through a state of volatility where it's being shaken up and broken and destroyed and struck by lightning and completely torn asunder. And now everybody is seeing the man who is standing beneath that public persona because lightning has struck and completely destroyed his temple that he was hiding himself in, and now the world can see him for who he is. That is more within keeping with the story that we're telling than any random stupid thing I could say about the 11th house. And what I think astrologers need to know is that a lot of the things that we say is both random and stupid insofar as it dilutes the larger content of the story that has already been established. So as an astrologer, I think one of the things that you can take into your personal practice that will be helpful for you is if you see yourself moving down a particular narrative or down a particular path with your reading, keep going. Don't stop. Don't look back. Don't take 1,000. Keep going. Because the reality is the story that is building momentum is oftentimes the story that is correct. That's not going to be the case every single time. However, more often than not, the story that is building momentum is the story that is going to be correct. Astrology is, from my perspective, astrology could be one of the most simple things in the world or the simplest thing in the world, but we complicate it because when we see a chart, we stop. There's a part of our brain that stops realizing that this is a chart of a human life, and there are only so many ways that a human life story can be put together in a way that makes sense. And so, because we've learned some astrologies, we try to put together the life of that person in a way that makes no sense whatsoever. You would never put that sort of story together if you were writing that story down in your journal. So why try to force those elements together when you're reading a chart? A chart is the same as the life of a person, and in the same way as there's only so many ways a life can make sense, there's only so many ways a natal astrology reading can make sense. And if you force yourself to always make sense whenever you read the natal chart, you will dramatically increase your accuracy in your natal astrology. If you love the astrology that you see here on the Oraculous podcast and you want to dive into the lab where we are practicing not only this astrology, but also the magical tools that have made me who I am today, then by all means join us in Michael's Cosmic Conservatory. In Michael's Cosmic Conservatory, I teach you everything that is within me, not just about astrology, but also about the magical practices such as the Kabbalistic Tarot, geomancy, and other forms of astral divination so that you can increase not only your astrological knowledge, but also so that you can deepen your spiritual connection to this astrology that we know and love. So if this is something that you're interested in, then by all means join us in our members-only space, Michael's Cosmic Conservatory, and dive into the magic that we share there each and every month. Now, let's move on with this. So we've spoken about the afflictions that the Mars is receiving, which is wonderful, because that serves to only further corroborate things that we already thought we knew. And now, finally, we're going to take a look at the fact that this Uranus is also in a conjunction with his natal Venus. Now, that could very well indicate from a universal perspective that his love life is being shaken up, as one would expect. So his romantic affairs could be shaken up, as one would expect. But at the same time, from a specific signification perspective, that Venus is specifically ruling his 4th house and his 5th house of pleasure. Let's talk about the 4th house. This can be an indication that the home that the native finds himself living in is attracting so much lightning to it, attracting so much chaos to it, attracting so much volatility to it, attracting so much jostling to it that it no longer feels like a safe space for him to root himself within the world and conduct his affairs. Why am I saying that? Because who's the ruler of the 4th house, if not Venus? Also, what does the 4th house rule/represent, if not our domestic affairs? So the home is going through this great state of jostling and turmoil and tumult and all of these chaotic events that it might feel for him as if it's time for him to leave that home behind. Similarly, this Venus is ruling his 5th house of pleasure and also his 5th house of children. And this can be an indication that the intersection for him between pleasure and children is also being jostled and interrupted and volatilized, if that's a word. I don't think it's a word, but it's also attracting to itself some high level of volatility, which is making it seem as if for him within this lifetime, or within the 6-month period at the very minimum, there is going to be a sense of destabilization in the things that once brought him a sense of pleasure. And that destabilization in the things that once brought him pleasure, it's also connected to the destabilization he feels in terms of his home base beneath his feet, which is probably causing him to feel as if, hey, time to pack up our bags and skedaddle. And that's probably exactly what he did upon him being released from prison. And we know he was released from prison because he definitely got arrested again in 2019. Now, one of the things that I definitely find to be interesting within this chart is that he has Neptune as a malefic also in a conjunction with his natal nodal axis. The nodes from a Uranian astrology perspective indicates our intimate connections. And insofar as he is having his intimate connections Neptuned at this time, that can be an indication that at this time he's finding disappointment and disillusionment within his intimate connections, and possibly things that he used to do that he thought would keep him safe, or things in which he would find safety are things at this moment that are no longer having the ability to support him in the ways that he desired to be supported, essentially. Clearly, we also have the Jupiter in a square relationship with his nodes. But remember, whenever I'm looking at an eclipse chart, I'm really not necessarily looking at the aspects of Jupiter. We can also clearly see that he has Jupiter in opposition to his natal Jupiter, which may hold some level of relevance or meaning. But at the same time, my main point in looking at an eclipse chart is really seeing where lightning is going to strike for the native within the coming 6-month period. And if I wanted a larger context for how these transiting planets within the eclipse was going to impact his life in general this year, I wouldn't be looking at the eclipse chart, but rather I would be looking at the solar return chart. All right, so here we have the eclipse for July 2nd, 2019. We know that he got arrested on July 6th, 2019. Therefore, this eclipse is most definitely the one that is corresponding with his arrest. Now, as you know, the very first thing that we do when we take a look at eclipse charts is we want to see in which house the eclipse is landing. And the reason for that is because eclipses represent crises that unfold within our lives within a 6-month period. And the reason why we're using a 6-month period is because that is the typical interval between 2 eclipses. And as you would know from the previous part of this video, let me not even say that. And as you would know from our previous eclipse segment, we've already stated that we only use the solar eclipse when doing natal predictive work. We don't use the lunar eclipse. Maybe it's important for something, but in general, we tend to use the solar eclipse. So, first thing that we want to do is we want to see in which house this eclipse is landing for him natally. And we see that the eclipse is in his 7th house. Now, some of you would look at this and say, Michael, the eclipse is clearly in his 6th house. However, we know that there's a rule within traditional astrology that says that if a planet is within 5 degrees of the next house cusp and in the same sign as the next house cusp, then that planet should be thought to be in that next house. This eclipse is definitely within 5 degrees of the next house cusp, which is his 7th house. It is definitely in the same sign as that next house cusp, which is his 7th house, and which is Cancer. Therefore, this is actually a 7th house eclipse. I think this is uncanny because in his first arrest, the eclipse was in the 3rd house, landing on the ruler of his 7th house. And here within the second arrest, we have the eclipse in the 7th house and conjunct the 7th house cusp. Therefore, this is indicating to us the likelihood that this year he is going to undergo some major crisis within his life as far as his intimate connections are concerned. And the reality is that his intimate connections were primarily with minors. So even though on the one hand, we might say, oh, this could be him going through a divorce, or this could be him going through some major legal process, since we know that the 7th house is the house of litigation as well. Truthfully, his intimate connections were ultimately minors. And that's why in the first eclipse that we looked at in 2006, we saw the eclipse landing on this moon. And that was an indication of what unfolded for him, which, as we know, unfolded as a result of an argument being had between 2 schoolgirls. And similarly, we see this eclipse conjunct his 7th house cusp, which is ruled by that same moon, and the eclipse is also afflicting that same moon. Therefore, this is once again tying in this idea of his intimate connections being a source of crisis for him within his life, and his intimate connections being the primary area of crisis for him within this life. So that is what we see under the auspices of this present eclipse. Now, the very next thing that I would do is I would say, what is this eclipse afflicting within his chart? Because an eclipse is only going to be as important for us as the house that it afflicts or the planets that it afflicts. And I take that back, not necessarily as the house that it afflicts, because all of us are going to have the eclipse falling in one of our natal houses every single 6 months. That is just a fact of life. But another fact of life is that all of us don't go through major life crises every single 6 months. That is something that just doesn't happen. Therefore, when we look at this, we have to see whether or not this eclipse is specifically afflicting things within his natal chart, because if the eclipse is afflicting things within his natal chart, then that is an indication for us that the topics that those things rule are going to be under affliction for him within this coming period of time. Now, the eclipse is most definitely afflicting one of the most important parts of his natal chart, which is his ascendant-descendant axis. Therefore, we really don't need to dig any deeper because this eclipse is baked in and built into the realities of his life within this coming 6-month period. So yes, this eclipse is most definitely going to be a major augmenting factor or a major influencing factor for him within this next 6-month period. Now from there, we go and we take a look and see, is there anything else within the chart being afflicted by this eclipse? We see that the eclipse is landing on his natal Uranus. And once again, the only reason why that Uranus is even up for discussion is because that Uranus is also conjunct his ascendant-descendant axis. And as a result of that, this eclipse is triggering the latent power of that Uranus and causing upheaval and volatility and stress and strife and lightning to strike at the very stability of what he assumes his intimate romantic connections to be. This is interesting because this paints the picture of a man who was having the time of his life, having the romantic experiences that he always desired with minors. And that represented a source of stability for him, a source of comfort, a source of calm, a source of this is what life should be like. This is what is right with the world. The fact that I can have these intimate connections with minors. And then all of a sudden it gets struck by lightning and the whole thing comes crumbling down. And this is a chart of do it to me once, shame on you. Do it to me twice, shame on me. Because he already went through the same thing. He was already arrested for the same thing. And we saw the evidence of this arrest previously when the previous eclipse in 2006 was afflicting his chart in the exact same way. In 2006, when he first got arrested for his solicitation of minors, the eclipse was afflicting his ascendant-descendant axis, triggering that Uranus, and also afflicting his natal moon, which is the ruler of his 7th house. In the second arrest, in July of 2019, the eclipse is afflicting his ascendant-descendant axis, triggering the latent part of his destiny held within that Uranus, and also afflicting the natal moon, which just so happens to be the ruler of his 7th house. This eclipse has come back to him in the exact same way to find out, sir, have you learned your lesson? And he said, no. Because what lesson where? He learns no lesson. And therefore, the same quality of eclipse triggered the same quality of experiences for him within the year 2019. Now that we've already looked at the planets within his chart being afflicted by this eclipse, now we can go and take a look at the ways in which the malefics within the eclipse chart are also afflicting other planets within his natal chart. And to that end, one of the first things I see is that he has Saturn afflicting his ascendant-descendant axis. Now, we cannot make this stuff up because in 2006, he had that same Saturn afflicting his IC-MC axis. Now the Saturn, like the eclipse itself, is afflicting his ascendant descendant axis. In 2006, we had his natal sun afflicted by the Saturn, which isn't the same this year, but it was a very Saturnian eclipse for him then, and we see this being a very Saturnian eclipse for him now. What does the Saturn afflicting the ascendant descendant say? It says that this year, this native is once again faced with the consequences of his actions at a level that the universe is demanding and saying, hey, do you see what I see? Do you actually realize the intensity and the severity of what you've done? Can you own up to the consequences that are a natural extension of the sort of criminal activity and criminal behavior that you have been conducting in the world up until this point? Is what that Saturn is saying. It is a year, or rather an eclipse season, in which he feels cold and alone and isolated and depressed and worried, and where he is feeling the weight of responsibility landing on his shoulders, and where he's also feeling the heaviness of his own actions landing on his shoulders, and him having to pay the piper in responsibility, or rather, him having to pay the piper in response to those negative actions that he would have done in the world up until this point. So it's a very stressful time for him. It's a very contentious time for him. It's a very harsh feeling moment within the life of this native. Now we go and we see what else that eclipse is triggering within this chart. I'm not a Saturn Chiron person from a predictive astrology perspective. I'll say that now. However, from a medical astrology perspective, I know that Saturn Chiron is one of the astrological combinations that has to do with a wound that cannot heal. So while I am not prone to take the Saturn Chiron, which is the eclipse Saturn conjunct his natal Chiron, within this eclipse season, because that's just not the sort of astrology I like to play. However, from a medical astrology perspective, Saturn Chiron has to do with wounds that cannot heal. And I think for him, his sexual proclivities really were a set of wounds that could not heal, which is why we see this eclipse coming with some of the same themes it came with in 2006 to indicate to us that this man is just built this way. Which, I know that, and I don't mean to go on my modern astrology rant, but I too am just built this way, and no matter how hard I try, I always end up saying the same things. I know that in modern astrology, there's very little that's wrong with the world, and everybody is rehabilitatable, or everybody can undergo a process of rehabilitation. Because in modern astrology, we don't like to call a spade, and everybody is a wonderful human being, is the modern astrology battle cry. Not this person. And from a traditional perspective, we see that not this person, because even though the integration of Chiron into our astrology may not be the most traditional thing in the world, we're not using it as the ruler of a house. We're using Chiron as the significator of a concept. And the concept is Chiron representing a wound that cannot heal, and Saturn representing the festering of that wound to make sure that it definitely will not heal, not in this lifetime. So what is the wound for him that cannot heal? It is the wound of him being a pedophile. And here we see the truth of that coming to bear within this eclipse period. Now, what else is happening within this eclipse? We also see the Saturn conjunct his natal Mercury. And we also see the South Node conjunct his natal Mercury. But I'm going to talk about the Saturn. The Saturn is conjunct his natal Mercury. And the combination of Mercury-Saturn from a Uranian astrology perspective is a combination that means to say goodbye. This is one of the combinations that we look at when somebody's going to relocate for a long time or when somebody has intentions of not being around any longer. The Mercury-Saturn combination specifically means to say goodbye. And so this could have been him saying goodbye, and this could have been an indication of him saying goodbye to the world at large. People like to drag me into the discussion as to whether or not I believe Jeffrey Epstein is actually dead. I don't know. And for those of you who say, stop being stupid, the government has told us that he's dead. The government has told us a lot of stuff. The government has also told us that Cuba, for example, is the most evil place in the world. And I'm a person who went to school in Cuba. I was trained in Cuba. I love Cuba with every single fiber of my being. I love the people in Cuba. And I hate seeing what the US is doing to Cuba right now at this moment, because Cuba is a lovely, wonderful country. The safest I've ever felt in my entire life was when I was in school in Cuba. And I go back to Cuba every 3 months, and it's still the safest place in the world for me. It is the most wonderful place in the world, and Cuba is dying in need of tourism. And the only reason why it doesn't have tourism is because of the United States of America. Cuba is a wonderful country, but the government of America told us that it is not. And as a result of that, every man, woman, child, and all the stray dogs and cats in Cuba are suffering for no reason whatsoever. I could go deeper into it, but the point of the matter is, I do not believe that the government is the standard of anything insofar as truthfulness is concerned, because it's the same government that redacted everybody's names from the Epstein files who could potentially be a person who needs to go to jail. And they keep on releasing a slaughtering lamb every now and again. So now Deepak Chopra's head is on the chopping block because the government felt as if he was disposable or as if he was expendable. But Deepak Chopra isn't the most prominent person in those Epstein files. Deepak Chopra is a prominent person, and the release of his name has given us all something to talk about, and it's given us all something to buzz about. But Deepak Chopra's name isn't the most prominent name. We're only talking about it because he's supposed to be a spiritual guru and all of that stuff, but he's not the most prominent person. So the government lies. I think this is just a fact of life. I'm pretty sure all governments around the world truly lie, but the government of the United States of America most definitely lies. So, do I know whether or not Jeffrey Epstein is dead? Not I, said the cat. Do I believe the government in them stating that he's dead? Not really. Do I know from an astrological perspective that he's alive? Nope. I also don't know from an astrological perspective if Tupac is alive. But the point of the matter is that this combination of the Saturn-Mercury, or rather Mercury-Saturn, is a combination to say goodbye, which means that probably even if he is alive and just hiding out someplace, he said goodbye in such a permanent way that we're never going to know the truth about it. Because the people who are on Jeffrey Epstein's island are definitely people powerful enough to make somebody disappear indefinitely while still being alive. So anyway, I don't mean to be a conspiracy theorist, but I don't think that it's a conspiracy to say that the government is definitely a lying institution. So that is the Saturn-Mercury, or rather the Mercury-Saturn. Now let's move on. Now, the very next thing that we see within this chart is the combination of Neptune in a conjunction to his natal Mars. And once again, Neptune conjunct his natal Mars has to do with him, once again, not feeling safe within his local environment, because that natal Mars is the ruler of his third house. And the third house is most definitely the house of our local environment, our community, basically. We saw this in the previous eclipse with the Uranus conjunct that natal Mars. So once again, it's the same story, different cast. Similarly, we see that Neptune is standing in a conjunction also with his natal Venus. And the fact that the Neptune is conjunct his natal Venus is the same thing that we saw in the previous eclipse when the Neptune was conjunct his nodal axis, because the nodal axis represents our intimate connections, but Venus also represents our romantic connections. Therefore, Neptune conjunct the Venus is saying that now he's starting to realize that his romantic affairs were actually rooted in something that was a complete fantasy, and that underneath the surface of that fantasy was nothing stable at all that could actually sustain him. So that's the Neptune with the Venus. And finally, within this chart, we see that he also has the Uranus in a conjunction with his IC. Or better yet, he has the Uranus in a conjunction with his MC-IC axis, which is once again symbolizing that his entire world, his entire root of stability within the world, his entire operation is coming to a screeching halt. And this is manifesting as a shock to his system, a shock to his system as a human being, but also a shock to his system as a man specifically, because we also find that Uranus is in a square relationship to his natal sun. This is in no way, shape, or form meant to be an easy 6-month period for him. And within the life of Jeffrey Epstein, this period of time most definitely manifested as a period of abject crisis. And of course, I see it, you see it, we all see it. I'm pretty sure that there's somebody who wants me to talk about the fact that the eclipse Mars is also in opposition to his natal sun, which could once again just be an indication that this is a period in time in which he may feel accosted, or this is a period in time in which he may feel violated, or this is a period in time in which he may feel as if he himself is under attack, or this is a period of time in which he may feel in some way rough-handled or manhandled, because Mars is the god of war. Mars is also a god of litigation. Mars is also a god of being in a state of battle with the world around us. So he might feel as if he's in a state of battle with everybody, and he's also in this very volatile state that is feeling like a complete rupturing of anything that he knew before as far as stability was concerned, and that ultimately leaves him feeling like a wraith within the world, that leaves him feeling as if he has no sense of where he's going, because everywhere he turns and looks, his life is being shaken, because this entire 6-month period represents a crisis of unparalleled proportions that is hitting the very core of his soul and psyche within this year of 2019. So that is it for our look at these two eclipses that correspond with the arrest of Jeffrey Epstein. First was the eclipse that corresponded with July 2006. Secondly was this eclipse that corresponds with July 2019. And I sincerely hope that you learned something from this broadcast.